Welcome to the P-Brain Podcast, Episode 2. Today I have a subject that's very important, and I'm going to be driving, so if I zone out a little bit at certain times, just bear with me. But the subject of today's podcast is, how do I pick a programming language? And more specifically, I'll be talking about market adoption, not just from the market adoption perspective of how many developers are using this programming language, but also you need to think about how many companies are using the programming language. What is the reach of that programming language? And when you're making this very important decision with your career that could affect the next 10, 20, 30 years of your life, you realize that choosing a programming language is very important. And for a very good reason, people will get very worked up about this subject because they have a family to feed maybe. And when you've committed 10, 20, 30 years of your life to a programming language, you become very familiar with it. And like I said, when your livelihood is tied to that programming language, it's so a lot of these debates that occur regarding programming languages, very often they call this a flame war, where people's emotions get so fired up, and eventually someone is going to use an insult, and then then it gets really out of control. So you've got communities like Hacker News, which I would say is sort of one of the most critical forums right now for determining how popular a programming language is. And one of the ways that they keep this, one of the ways they keep the flame wars under control is they have a karma system, karma points. So it's a lot like Reddit, where you have votes, up votes, down votes, and so on. And I won't really be getting, I'll try to explain it as something that people get fired up about, but I'm going to take a really irrational approach, and I've seen this play out over the decades, and I think perspective is really important when you're choosing a programming language. I highly recommend talking to older developers because they've been through it all. They've been through the shiny object syndrome, where people are just trying out a new language because it's cool. I remember in 1994, I had one of my first copies of Wired magazine, and the pages were glittering with silver ink, and the pages were pink and gold and all these bright, sparkly colors. This was the first time that fashion brands were advertising in technology magazines. And, for the first time ever in history, writing code was something that was really cool. And at that point in my life, I was completely immersed in technology. And so I was really, without going into a lot of detail, I think I was pretty susceptible to trying out new technology because I had nothing to lose. I was just a teenage kid, and I thought I was going to be the next Bill Gates, really. There was no doubt in my mind. So, of course, I thought I knew everything, and I remember I was talking to one of the lead developers of the OS/2 operating system, and, obviously he was very committed to the C language. He was a veteran of, he was, one of the lead developers of OS2. And I was telling him, there's this new language. Well, because, and we were talking about this because he was showing me a prototype of this thing called OpenDoc, which was a collaboration between IBM and Apple. It was like a secret project. And it was, we were testing this OpenDoc platform on a machine, on a computer that had 6 CPUs. I mean, this was unheard of at the time when you went to the store to buy a computer, most of the computers only had 1 processor. Well, we were testing this thing on a computer with 6 processors, and when you would drag the window across the screen, it was literally so slow you could look at your watch and wait like 15 seconds before the thing would redraw. And of course it was in debug mode, but, I'm getting off into the weeds. Basically, I remember his name. His name was Benny Higton, I think. And I was telling Benny, I said, there's this new thing called Java, and it's multi-platform, and, I think IBM should be using that instead of this OpenDoc thing because Java is supposed to be platform independent. And he's like, oh, no, I can do any of that stuff in C. Well, 5 years later, I turned out to be right. IBM shifted their strategy to Java. I mean, actually, it was probably more than 5 years. It was maybe 8 years later, IBM took my advice and shifted their strategy to Java. Probably, I don't think it probably had nothing to do with anything I said to Benny. I mean, of course, there's a remote possibility that IBM got the tip from him, but the reason why IBM waited that long to adopt Java is most likely they had to wait for the technology to mature. So anytime there's a new technology, it might take 10, 15 years to mature. Because even if it's going to be the next greatest thing, and you're absolutely 100% sure, like you're some kind of Steve Jobs visionary, and I mean, even Steve Jobs, as much as people praise him, he was completely wrong about, you know, some of his choices. Like, for instance, Objective-C. I think Apple is still regretting that Steve Jobs was using this, like, Next platform or whatever. I don't even remember the name of Steve Jobs' operating system. But if you look up the Wikipedia entry, and there's a lot of heated arguments over this because, everybody loves Steve Jobs. But if you look up the Wikipedia entry for Steve Jobs' work, you'll see that, some of his early stuff was not commercially successful at all. And I would argue the what's his language that got rolled into Apple products, Objective-C. That's the only and I apologize for the bumpy road there. I shouldn't have taken that farm road. I'm in Texas where the roads can be bumpy sometimes. And I brought this up on Hacker News one time, and I said, Objective-C is really only used by Apple, and it's kind of stupid to bet your billion-dollar company on a dead programming language that nobody uses. Oh my goodness, I started up a whole, and of course I had literally 200 people piled on me, and they're like, "Oh no, you're wrong," and I lost 200 karma points for that. But that just shows you how many programmers are out there that have no perspective, and they're saying, "Oh no, it's not 15 minutes of fame," because I think I used the word 15 minutes of fame because I'm thinking in terms of decades, and they're thinking in terms of like, a fly on the wall's lifespan. Because a lot of these people just learned how to program within the last couple of years, and they think Steve Jobs is a god or something. So, anyway, people get really worked up about this. If you criticize Apple, they're gonna go crazy. But Apple ended up taking my advice. Not only did they release, not only did they release the Swift programming language, which was much more modern and sensible, but they open sourced it. So they, as much as I got criticized for that, they took my advice very swiftly. They swiftly took my advice, and you know, now Objective C is not as important as Swift. They're shifting their focus to an open source programming language that actually has a future of surviving. Objective C was was a dead end, and that was pretty much, nobody at Apple really, probably nobody challenged Apple because everyone thought, oh, well, Apple's so commercially successful, how could we possibly challenge that? But, a lot of times you need someone that's an independent thinker to look at things from a more experienced perspective. And I won't just be talking about Apple. So let's go back in history even further. I remember in 1994, I was reading about how great this new Java programming language was, and I totally drank the Kool-Aid. And the advocates for Java were really firm about why you should learn Java and use Java. I mean, the Java programming language hadn't even been released yet, and already the evangelists were out there in full force publishing books saying you must learn Java now because it's going to be the next greatest thing. And the reason is that it's a more portable language, which means you'll be able to reach more devices, more computer devices. And, that's really important if you want people to use your application. And back in those days, if you put yourself back in time, and the analogy today would be Apple versus Android. Which platform do you want access to? But before, okay, so let's just go back in time there. It was Windows. Windows had the most users, but you know, there was more platforms out there besides Windows. And if you were thinking about being platform independent, you would want to think about using Java, especially with the internet now, where you had. And back in those days, anything was this whole feeling of anything was possible. A new computer manufacturer could come out of nowhere with something, and they could be the next greatest thing. So back then there was a lot of innovation in hardware, and there's new platforms all the time. Maybe like today. So that was one of the important things. The other important thing with Java was that it did garbage collection. If you don't know what garbage collection is, one of the main pain points with the C programming language was that you had to manage your own memory. So you literally had to be, the programmer had to be involved in the meticulous, really painful process of managing how your data fit into the computer's memory. You can imagine how difficult that was. And they had, if you took an advanced placement computer programming class, this was part of your education. You would have to learn all about pointers and how your memory would fit into the computer. And it was really absurd. I mean, so Java realized that this is something that people should not have to deal with. This is something that computers should take care of for us. So Java came up with this thing called garbage collection, where we'll manage your memory for you. Now that was really, really important, and I think that was one of the reasons why Java caught on, because from a ease of use perspective, that was a huge innovation. So anytime you have a gigantic leap in ease of use, for instance, garbage collection, that's almost a no-brainer when you see something, and an innovation like that doesn't come along very often. I mean, it's something that comes along maybe once every 10, 20 years. And garbage collection was one of those things. Another example of a huge leap in ease of use would be PHP. Um, and actually, the letters PHP stand for Pretty Helpful Programming Language. And the word helpful there is key, because if you remember, Perl, the Perl programming language, that was the main programming language in use on the internet. And it was very, very tedious just to get any data back from the user. So PHP, the developer who, from what I remember reading about him, he was not like a real sophisticated computer programmer. He just realized what most people realized was that Perl was just, you know, it was way too complicated to get data from the user, and he wanted to change that. So he came up with PHP, which made it easier to get data from the user. That was the main leap there with PHP. And the other giant leap there was he allowed you to write your code right into the HTML web page. That was a huge leap in ease of use, because before PHP, you would have had to have a separate file to, you would have to have a separate file for your code and then a separate file for your HTML. And, let's forget the whole argument that code should be separate from, your logic should be separate from your views and all that. But the point there is that PHP was a huge leap in ease of use. Java was also a leap in security, and I would say security is really important, but if you're a young developer, or if you're new to software development, I wouldn't let people scare you about security. People will say, "Oh, well, PHP is so insecure, and I could hack your web page 100 different ways," and they'll brag to you about how vulnerable PHP is. But when it comes down to it, um, you know, you say to that person, "Okay, well, let's see, let's pick out a website that's coded in PHP, like, the New York Times or something, and let's see you hack it." They're not going to be able to do it, because PHP is really not as vulnerable as people say it is. And yes, the New York Times was hacked probably like 10, 15 years ago. I don't even remember when the New York, a lot of these early news sites were hacked early on, but a lot of those things, a lot of those loopholes get closed if they're, if it's a popular programming language, the security holes will get closed pretty fast. So any kind of mature programming language is going to be relatively secure, and so I wouldn't let security be too much of a concern. But where you have to be concerned about security is, um, for instance, I recommend, if you're picking out like a web server, web servers can be really vulnerable to attacks, especially if you're installing a lot of different kinds of software. As a general rule of thumb, anything that's new is going to be more vulnerable to attacks. So, for instance, the Fedora operating system is going to be more vulnerable than most operating systems, but that's by design, because Fedora prides itself on adding the latest experimental features, the latest experimental technology. So if you're a younger programmer, I would recommend you learn something that's already mature and something that people are already using. And don't worry about the security too much because that will take care of itself for the most part. And it's something that you'll learn anyway. Every programming language you can make security mistakes, so it's important that you make basic. That's something you'll learn as a developer over time. The next thing is performance. A lot of people talk about performance problems. Oh, you shouldn't learn PHP because it's slow. Or back in the early, back from between 1994 and 2004, maybe even between 1994 and 2006, it was a really bad idea to use JavaScript because the performance was horrible. So there's a perfect example of a technology that most people could agree had promise, and obviously it was a giant leap in ease of use. Well, that's not really true, but it was a giant leap forward it was a giant innovation because that was the first time you were able to really run code in the browser on the client side. Everyone could agree that was important, but the technology was pretty much useless for at least 10 years because it was just way, way too slow to be useful to anyone. So there's an example of learning the shiny new thing is not a good idea. You might have to wait 10 years before it's actually useful. And here's the thing, if you had learned Java or C instead of JavaScript during that 10-year period, you would have been employed and you would have been learning a lot. And what happened was JavaScript ended up becoming a lot like other programming languages over that period of time. As JavaScript matured, it became more and more like all the established programming languages. So you weren't really missing out by not jumping on the bandwagon to learn JavaScript. I learned JavaScript. I taught myself JavaScript in 1994 in the very first web browser that supported it, and that was Netscape Navigator Gold. And I drank the Kool-Aid and thought, okay, this is going to be great. For the first time, I can have menus that pop up and you can interact with the user. Well, I quickly found out that this technology was full of all kinds of problems. One of the biggest problems with JavaScript was, you spend an entire day building this beautiful interface that interacts with the user, and then what happens is the next version of JavaScript comes out, they go up, let's say they go up by 0.1. Like, we're not even talking a major version change. We're just talking about just going up from version, 2.2 to 2.3. Between 2.2 and 2.3, your entire application could break. And JavaScript was notorious for crashing people's computers. The browser would freeze, and that was just. And I think spammers probably used that ability to crash the browsers as a way to keep people from, maybe they would use that to keep people from leaving a web page or something. So, and that's not something that I can. I'm not an expert on why people would want to crash a browser, but you can imagine there's probably some SEO trick there where you would want to crash somebody's browser. In any case, the important thing is that performance is a concern. However, for web pages, I think people spend too much time talking about performance issues. I think unless you're running some kind of business where you have millions of users like Facebook, you're probably not dealing with performance problems um, from the perspective of your programming language, or unless you're doing some really complex simulation that does a lot of math. The performance of your programming language is probably not the issue. More than likely, the performance bottleneck is going to be something to do with the database. So performance, I would say, is really not that big of a deal when you're choosing a programming language. I already talked about ease of use a little bit. The important thing with ease of use, now let's use Ruby as an example. I was on the very first web host that used Ruby, which was site5.com. They're still around. I would not, well, the company has changed hands maybe a couple times. And early on, they were the first web host to support Ruby. And at that time, everyone was very excited about Ruby. It was going to be the next great, cool language. And I gave it a fair chance. I researched it, and I found that installing the installation instructions to get Ruby working were just, it wasn't super, super difficult, but it was just difficult enough that I could see this was not going to catch on in any way, because in order for something to catch on, it has to be easy enough for the average person to install it and use it. And if it's a little bit too complicated for the average person to use, then it's not going to catch on. That's just deductive reasoning. And if you remember back that far, there was this new peer-to-peer social network that was written in Ruby, and I can't remember what the name of it was, but I remember saying on my blog, I don't think this peer-to-peer program, I don't think this P2P social network will catch on because they're using Ruby. And I turned out to be right, and I think that social network might still be around. I can't even remember the name of it now. But one of the developers committed suicide just because they were so disappointed that it didn't catch on the way that they thought it would. So, don't kill yourself over this stuff. It's not worth it. But something you need to pay attention to, there's different kinds of market adoption, and I think the most important thing when choosing a programming language is the market adoption. And there's different markets. There's the market of developers. So this is sort of the popular opinion of what other developers are saying. And that's sort of important when the programming language is first catching on, because if there's not enough consensus that this thing is going to be cool, then it's not going to catch on. It just won't. And I can't really think of any great examples of that right now, but Ruby, I'd say, is almost in that category where I've heard a couple of Ruby developers saying they sort of regret jumping on the Ruby bandwagon because it didn't turn out to be as popular as they wanted it to be, and I think some people have argued that Ruby is dying. But it does seem like people are still talking about Ruby. There's still Ruby jobs out there. There's still development shops that are using Ruby, so I think it will survive. But in terms of that leap of usefulness, Ruby didn't offer a large enough leap in usefulness over the established language that was already there, which was Java. So Ruby was trying to advertise itself as being one of the things they advertised was that the syntax of Ruby is so much more beautiful than Java, but it wasn't that much better that it was worth changing languages. The other thing that Ruby really advertised was this whole Ruby on Rails thing, which was rapid application development. Like, I can create a blog platform in 15 minutes by using Rails. Okay, no, that sounds cool if you don't know anything about computer programming. You're thinking, oh, great, I can just do this Rails thing, and I'll be able to like develop my application in half the time. Realistically, that sounds good, but in real life, the value of your software application is really the value of your application is largely determined by the uniqueness of it. So if you create a blog platform that looks like all the other blog platforms because it's using some kind of standardized code, um, it's not going to catch on. People aren't going to look at it and say, wow, this is so cool. And that cool factor often is largely determined by how unique something is. So let's say you create a blog platform using Twitter Bootstrap. People are going to look at it and say, you know, this doesn't look like, this is not cool because I've already seen this before. The buttons just look like Twitter Bootstrap buttons, and the form fields look like Twitter Bootstrap form fields. I just, you know, that unexplainable quality that gets people excited. It's usually due to custom code, customizations, people coding things from scratch. When you have a software application that was made from scratch in a really original, unique way, that gets people excited. So the first time someone saw, um, first time someone saw an Amiga computer and the interface was completely original, the colors and the graphics were just really unique. I mean, that gets people excited because it's new and original. So um, when you do things um, using standard frameworks, that's the risk of just looking like everyone else's application. That's definitely a risk to consider. Um, so developer adoption, that's important, but realize that popular opinion among developers is not always the deciding factor, because maybe, and if you go to Hacker News, um, it used to be that Hacker News was sort of where the tastemakers hung out. But I think what's happening over the years is that there's so many developers on there that are inexperienced. They really don't have the perspective, and I think what you're finding is that a lot of those people are just sheep. I mean, I hate to say it, but they're just sheep. Like, the people that really matter are, the top executives at Google, or the top executives at um, you know IBM. These are the people that are making the important decisions about the future of programming languages. And in fact, the reason why JavaScript is so popular today and the reason why Node.js is so popular is because Google, the executives at Google said, hey, this JavaScript thing, well, first of all, Google had to make the smart decision to decide to make their own web browser. That was a pretty ballsy move to compete with Internet Explorer at that point. And a lot of people were shocked. I mean, wow, this search engine company is creating a web browser? I mean, that's pretty ambitious. And a lot of people didn't think it was possible, but they proved, I think that was one of the first times that Google proved that it could do anything, even though it had nothing to do with search engines. So first Google made that decision, and then they went a step further and said, okay, we've got this JavaScript thing. It's really terrible, but it has so much promise. Why can't we just I need to turn the air conditioner on. Why can't we just make JavaScript faster? So Google, and this is what I heard, I don't know the whole story here, but apparently Google decided they are going to rewrite the JavaScript engine from scratch. So that's why Java became so, that's why JavaScript became so popular in a short amount of time. And this happened right after Mashable was just taking off. I remember talking to Pete Cashmore. Pete Cashmore sponsors for one of the events he was doing, and I was saying, why are you using JavaScript? Because it's so slow. And shortly after that, Google rewrote the engine from scratch. And what I heard was that engine was the foundation of Node.js. So the reason why Node is so fast is because of Google. They wrote that code to be faster, and they probably wrote it in C. C is still probably the fastest programming language that the die-hard developers are still using. If you want to make something really, really fast, use C, because C is it's more of a quote low-level language, which means you're closer to the hardware. So a lot of programming languages at their core were probably coded in C or are still coded in C under the covers somehow. And that's because those C developers have an intimate familiarity with the hardware. And so the closer you are to the hardware, the faster your code is going to run. And that's because it has to do with the assembly language. And the assembly language is where you're directly communicating with the hardware. So a lower level language, people don't really talk about this anymore because most computer languages that are out there are high level languages. But I guess you could say over time, even a high level language that's slow eventually will be optimized to the point where it's no longer an issue. And I think Facebook did that with PHP, where PHP was considered the slow language, and then it became worth it to Mark Zuckerberg to optimize it, because when you have a data center that's, costing many millions of dollars, and then you realize, hey, if we could make PHP just 20% faster, we would save millions of dollars in computer hardware and cooling systems. And, so that's why Facebook devoted the resources to rewrite PHP. So anyway, so let's move on to the next thing, which is platform reach. Now, like I was saying with Java, the main promise there was that the Java virtual machine was this idea that we'll create a virtual computer. It's called the JVM, also called the JVM. But the JVM is this software-based virtual computer that will run on any device. So as long as your computer can get the JVM, you should be able to run code on it. They called that write once, run everywhere. That was a really important concept. And it didn't really catch on for a long, long time. I mean, they promised it was write once, run everywhere, but in reality, it wasn't. It wasn't. They weren't able to deliver on that promise right away. It took a while for Java to mature, and I think once IBM realized that this was possible to write once, run everywhere, they they started integrating that into their strategy. But a more modern example would be Android versus Apple, so the iPhone versus the Android phones. And a lot of people in the United States think Apple is so great, and Apple is probably more popular than Android in the United States. If you go into a Starbucks, you'll probably see more Apple computers than Android computers. But what these people don't know is that Android is way, way more popular than Apple. Way more popular. So that's because people in the United States are just so isolated from the rest of the world. It's almost um, a joke, but it's true that people in the United States think the world revolves around them, and that's just not the case. And Google figured that out. The people at Google, I think, are really intelligent, and they realized this right away, which is why Android was written, which was Android was coded on Linux, and they used they used Java, which was a really smart thing. So they picked technology that they knew would be um, that they knew would have a future. Java has a future, Linux has a future. So right from the beginning, they were well ahead of Apple, which takes a more proprietary isolationist strategy. So in the short term, Apple is making a lot of money, and they have the United States. But in the long term, Android has already they've already dominated the world. So if you're a developer, you can't think like a person that lives in the United States. You need to be thinking about the rest of the world. You have to compete with the rest of the world. You have to be thinking, okay, what's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years? How many people are going to be using my application? If I code my app for iPhone, sure, I'll make a little bit more money and I'll be more popular with my friends in the United States, but 10 years from now, if you look at the adoption curve, um, you'll see that Android is by far the most popular operating system in the world. So you need, as a developer, you need to learn some marketing, and I highly recommend you study the market adoption curve. If you pick, and they also call this being an early adopter. If you're an early adopter, you may have some advantage, but the important thing is that your programming language has a future, and you also have to factor in risk. What is the risk of learning technology that's not going to catch on? And there was no guarantee. You learn something. You learn something that's it shows a lot of promise, and you think it's going to be the next greatest thing, but there's no proof. It's a risk. It's a gamble. So why would you learn something that might not work out? And especially if you're a new developer and you don't have the perspective to make sense of what everyone's saying. If you just listen to the popular opinion of what everyone's saying on Reddit or Hacker News, I guarantee you'll get a lot of bad advice, because most of the people on there, even if they have a lot of karma points, a lot of them don't know what they're talking about. And they might have had commercial success. That doesn't even tell you anything, because the people that are the most commercially successful aren't necessarily the smartest. That just means they took advantage of a short-term opportunity a lot of times. So you need to balance, like, how much risk am I willing to take, and versus, am I just trying to make money in the short term? Am I just trying to provide for my family? You have to weigh all these things. But I think the biggest factor you should consider is market adoption. And so where can you get some information about the market adoption of a programming language? You could talk to recruiters on LinkedIn and just ask them, well, what do you think? What kind of, where do you see the jobs? Like, where are the jobs really versus what are people, recommending? Because a lot of people say, oh, well, you should learn, like right now everyone's saying, learn JavaScript, learn JavaScript. And I think that's good advice, but I wouldn't always trust conventional wisdom. Let's see. Another place you can look is Google Trends. And this is really tricky because you could do a Google Trends search and compare the word Java to Ruby. The problem there is that Java is also a country, I think. It's also another way of saying coffee. Ruby is actually a precious stone. So there's using Google Trends is tricky. So you might have to isolate the search phrase. For instance, you might have to compare the word Java developer to Ruby developer. So you might have to add some extra keywords there and be really careful about how you're comparing things. But Google Trends can tell you a lot. But you have to be careful because just because a phrase like Java developer is trending or Ruby developer, just because that phrase is trending, it doesn't mean that the programming language is trending. That just means that people are looking for information about it. So there might be more Java jobs than ever in history, but maybe maybe there's not as much buzz about it, or maybe people already know about the language, so they're not using Google as much to look that up. So that's something you have to consider. Just because a lot of people are searching for a Java developer, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lot of people that are hiring Java developers. You have to factor in all the information that you can get. Another thing that you can do is, and this is not really helpful, but it's a little bit helpful. If you go into some of these marketplaces, like I don't even know what they are anymore because I don't use those marketplaces, but if you go to, like, for instance, a freelancer.com, if that website is still around, these marketplaces where people do software development for hire, I wouldn't recommend using one of those communities to get jobs or to outsource your work because the quality is really low and those people are working for minimum wage. But some of those communities do publish stats. So, for instance, the reason why I learned Nginx as a web server was because I think it was freelancer.com was advertising a job for someone to um, rewrite a platform to get off of Apache and into Nginx to increase performance. And when I saw that, okay, someone's actually willing to pay money for this technology, I said, hey, maybe I should learn Nginx instead of Apache. So that's what I did. And it was a great decision because now Nginx is the fastest growing web server in the world. And if you want to find stats about that, you can go to Netcraft. Just do a Google search for Netcraft. There's also data services that scan the entire internet, so they can tell you, I can't remember the name of these services, but if you email me or contact me on LinkedIn, I'll send you some links. There's different data services that crawl the web, and they can tell you what is the most popular version of JavaScript, what is the most popular operating system. They can tell you this, and that might be something that's useful to know. But a lot of programming languages aren't facing the public web, so that's not necessarily useful information. Another thing you can do is you can search LinkedIn for various technologies. So you might just go into LinkedIn and search for Java developer and see how many Java developers there are. Maybe there's not that many. So you might see a market need. You might say, wow, there's really a ton of Objective-C developers, but there's not as many Android developers. And because Android is a bigger market than iPhone, maybe I'll be more in demand if I learn how to use Java to code for Android. You can also code for Android using JavaScript. So if you, so I think you're pretty safe learning JavaScript at this point, but it depends on where you want to work. If you want to work for a major company, um, they're probably not using Java yet. Um, they're probably not using JavaScript. So larger companies will probably be using the more established languages that have been around longer, like Java. I think Uber is an example. I don't know what kind of technology that they're using now, but they were one of the first companies to use Node.js just because I think his name is Jason. He just he was one of the early employees of Uber, and they'd said, well, hey, you can code this in whatever you want. So he said, hey, well, let's try it in Node. And that turned out to be, he's an expert developer, so he decided that um, Node would be appropriate for that kind of the system that he was building. So you might want to ask a more experienced developer and say, look, I'm building this thing. What programming language do you think would be good for this thing that I'm building? And a lot of times it might just come down to choosing the best tool for the job. So what else do I have here? As you can see, there's a lot that I'm not even talking about. I'm not really getting into this whole syntax stuff, like this syntax is better than that syntax. That would fall under ease of use. And I wouldn't fall into that trap so much. I think you'll get down into the weeds with debating, is like strict typecasting and that kind of stuff. That's really, I think you're wasting your time getting into those debates. Okay, so I sort of talked about this already, planning too far ahead. And I think one of the, maybe a classic example of that is Java Applets. The idea was great. Like you could have this Java virtual machine running in the browser, and even with all of the optimizations, even with faster computers, it just never worked out. It was too slow, crashed everyone's computer, and it just never caught on. So there's an example of something that was just too ambitious, never caught on. And I spent a lot of time learning applets, like around 1998, and I thought it was going to catch on. It just never did. And it was really ugly too, because all the applets ran inside of this ugly window on the inside the browser. So it was ugly. It was slow. It was complete miserable failure, and it just never caught on. So there's the risk factor there. Some stuff that's new, it won't be around very long. Actually, most of the frameworks that are coming out now, they might be cool, but they're not going to, they won't last. That's just the way it is. So like I already said, sometimes it might be 10 years before something has really proven itself, before it's secure, before the performance has been improved. And there has to be, another thing is hiring developers. Let's say you're doing a startup and you pick a new framework that's cool, and then you start growing really, really fast. You might find it very, very difficult to hire people that know that framework or that language. So if you try to get too fancy with the new stuff, you might not be able to grow your company. So a lot of people are looking at programming languages from a very nerdy technical perspective, but I encourage everyone to think about programming languages from a marketing perspective. Look at the markets. Look at the markets for platforms. How popular is the platform that uses that programming language? How many developers are using that programming language, and how many companies are using that programming language? Those are 3 different areas that you should consider. So I hope that was helpful, and I can't believe I just spent an hour talking about how to pick a programming language, but that's, it's, and I'm just scratching the surface, really. There is a lot more there. And if you want to get into these long, drawn-out debates, all you have to do is look on websites like Hacker News, and you can probably find some of the older debates on a website called Slashdot. Slashdot. I'm sure there's debates on Reddit, and if you're able to find the archives, dig.com. I can't remember the guy who started. I think it was Kevin. Anyway, dig.com, that might have some of the older debates, but most of the more modern, most of the newer arguments you'll find on Hacker News. And Hacker News is under the Y Combinator umbrella, so it's a little tricky to find it, but you'll find it eventually. And this is something that comes up every couple of years. And the final word in all of the arguments about programming languages, it always comes down to using the best tool for the job, and usually that's the last word in all of the debates. All right, so I hope that was helpful. If you have any criticism, let me know. If you have any questions, just let me know. I'm accessible. Just send me an email or find me on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's probably the best place to find me. All right, thanks for listening.